is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Aerospace and renewables on the agenda. China and Algeria commit to strengthen ties as the two presidents meet in Beijing.
Our other headlines: heat waves burn forests and homes in Europe, including in Greece, where firefighters continue to battle flames near Athens.
China and the United States talk cooperation on climate change as both sides agree action must be accelerated.
Don't ration the chips. US semiconductor makers lobby the Biden administration amid concern about potential restrictions to China. And Great British Nuclear is launched, tasked with rapid expansion of nuclear energy in the move away from fossil fuels. China and Algeria are strengthening their relationship. Algeria's president has arrived in Beijing on his state visit.
China's President Xi Jinping says both sides should deepen collaboration in infrastructure and agriculture, as well as aerospace and renewable energy. Our correspondent Wang Mengjie reports from Beijing.
During the talks, President Xi and President Tabon have jointly charted the future growth of China-Algeria ties and held an in-depth exchange of views on regional and international issues. Noting that this year marks the 65th anniversary of the establishment of bilateral ties between China and Algeria, President Xi expressed China's commitment to work with Algeria to enhance the existing strategic partnership. President Xi called on both sides to support each other on core issues, hoping the two countries to continually enhance cooperation in various key sectors, including agriculture, food security, technology, renewable energy, infrastructure development such as roads and ports. In response, President Tabon said China is most important partner and friend for his country. He spoke highly of China's role in dealing with regional hotspot issues and the constructive role China played in promoting regional and global peace and stability. President Tabon said Algeria is willing to work closely with China in international and regional affairs. After their meeting, President Xi and President Tabon witnessed the signing of cooperation documents on various fields and issued a joint statement on bilateral cooperation. We know this is President Tabon's first China visit since taking office, but bilateral friendship is now being highlighted for the first time. In the new era, ties are growing stronger. The two sides established a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2014, making Algeria the first Arab state to forge one with China. Both sides have also had fruitful cooperation under the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. Trade between the two countries reached $9.4 billion in January 2023, a 60% increase compared to the year prior. To better combat COVID-19, Algeria helped produce China's Sinovac vaccines, and the country also sent its first communication satellite with China's help. As long-term partners, the friendship between China and Algeria has weathered all kinds of global challenges. That experts say President Tabon's visit will now bring ties to a higher level, building stronger branches from the deep roots.
Chinese Premier Li Qiang says climate change requires all countries to strengthen coordination and speed up action. Premier Li was speaking during a meeting with US climate envoy John Kerry in Beijing. Kerry said Washington is willing to strengthen cooperation with China to address climate change and other pressing global challenges. Kerry met China's senior diplomat Wang Yi, where he said climate talks could provide a new start to relations between the two countries. Our correspondent Dong Shui is in Beijing.
Kerry's third day in Beijing began with a meeting with senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi. They held a nearly 2 hour of talks earlier this morning at the Great Hall of the People. And in the opening remarks, Wang Yi urged Washington to take pragmatic and active policies to push forward future cooperations. And he said there is huge potential for cooperation between China and the United States in terms of climate. But at the same time, this cooperation relies on mutual understanding between the two countries. And Wang then said that he appreciated Kerry's work in pushing for climate cooperation since being appointed as a special envoy for climate change in the U.S. He said his works as a special envoy could be of long-term benefit for humanity. And he reiterated that building a green, low-carbon and sustainable development path for all nations was not only important for the next generation, but also a shared international responsibility. Wang then referred to President Xi Jinping's goal of building a shared future for mankind, saying climate cooperation is an inevitable part of that goal and that Beijing is willing to strengthen talks and search for better mutual solutions. Wang then expressed the hope that Kerry could play a positive and active role in pushing forward for future cooperation. Kerry obviously echoed this sentiment, saying he looks forward to being able to move forward and change the dynamics in the current bilateral relations. He said President Biden is very committed to stability within the China-U.S. relationship and also to working together to make a significant difference in the world. He said, and I quote, "We both know there are real differences, but we also know that from experiences, if we work at it, we can find the path ahead in ways that resolve these challenges." And the world is really looking to U.S. For that leadership, particularly on the climate issues. So both sides are calling for a change in the broader relationship in the hope that climate change cooperation could be that oasis amid the desert that in this strained bilateral relationship. Kerry also met with Chinese Premier Li Qiang earlier today and is scheduled to speak to the press tomorrow before he leaves the country. Well, it's his third visit to China as U.S. climate envoy, and the trip marks the formal resumption of top-level climate diplomacy between the two countries.
Around 70 million US residents are suffering with poor air quality as smoke from Canada's wildfires spreads across at least 20 northern states. This all comes as the country's southeast continues to bake under extreme heat. Our correspondent Adiz Tianchan is in Los Angeles. Adiz, tell us more about these air quality warnings. What's the advice?
Well, it's actually quite fascinating, isn't it? That is something that's happening not just across the border, but all the way in Western Canada is having such a huge impact in the United States, and actually the northeastern part of the United States. The visibility has diminished so much that, you know, people, especially in places like New York, where people go to travel, perhaps for tourism reasons, they're really not having a good time. And we are seeing health advisories for, in some cases, for the elderly to just not go out at all, for you know, ordinary adults to just avoid doing exercise outside, and for in some areas the air quality is so bad they're just saying, you know, limit your time outdoors as much as possible. And we're really talking about a huge area here. According to the Canadian officials, we're talking about roughly 900 wildfires across Canada. And this phenomenon has already happened, if you remember, earlier this month. And now with these fires raging pretty much out of control, it seems to be happening yet again. And as these fires continue to burn, of course, that smoke can take hours, in some cases several days, to reach across the border. So it's really the aftermath that, you know, millions of Americans are feeling on the other side of the border. And it's just very symbolic to see how climate change has no borders, and its impact is really being felt transnational way.
Indeed, smoke aside, the extreme heat continues in much of the country. How are people coping?
Well, especially here in Southern California, I would say there are really different stories, because you would go to a place like the Death Valley, for example. It's known to be one of the hottest spots on Earth, where, ironically, the place actually draws more tourists to the area at a time like even yesterday, for example. It didn't break its own all-time hottest temperature record, but it did reach 56 degrees, and some people went there to take pictures with the thermometer and just go through that unique experience, I guess, of feeling the 56 degrees. But it's really not that pleasant for the majority of the people, I would say, especially for those who have to work outdoors, particularly in places like Central Valley. You may remember California is really an agricultural hub in the United States. A lot of our farmlands are located in that Central Valley, where temperatures really tend to go up high, especially at a time like this. So we do understand a lot of the companies actually had to change their working hours for those farmers, where they try to start their day earlier to really avoid those peak temperatures throughout the day. And it really even changes some of the other activities, like even a horse race that was scheduled to take place last weekend was called off because they just simply thought it wasn't a sensible thing to do. So it's really taking a toll on everybody's life. And finally, it's important to mention that, California's infamous wildfire season has already kicked off, and not too far from here, Los Angeles, we already have 4 fires raging. One of them, especially the Rabbit Fire, has grown quite large and has come close to some residential areas where we're already seeing some evacuations.
Adiz, thank you. Our correspondent Adiz Tianchan in Los Angeles. Well, hundreds of firefighters in Greece are continuing to battle wildfires around the capital, Athens. Forests, homes and farmland have been destroyed, with high temperatures forecast to continue over the coming week. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas reports.
This one is quite wild, and it's not burning in low vegetation, it's burning in a pine forest, so it's making it very much difficult for the authorities and the firefighters to go into the area because it's thick forest. So far we have very high winds, and it's causing a lot of headaches because even the helicopters and the planes that are flying overhead to put out the fire cannot see due to the thick smoke. Now we're talking about a fire front that is close to 15 kilometers long. A number of people have been evacuated. More than 5 communities in the area had to be evacuated, a number of animals as well. And unfortunately, we saw ourselves few houses and factories being burned. That is the latest from here. Vehicles are going by, a number of firefighters. Now there's another fire that is just about 200 to 300 meters just behind us. You can see the black smoke coming out. That's another fire front. So anyway you turn your head, fire fronts are happening because of these different and difficult winds.
The Italian island of Sardinia is one of the areas experiencing searing temperatures. Italy's national forecaster is also predicting record heat in Rome. Well, our correspondent Giles Gibson is there. Giles, how are people in the city coping with these temperatures?
Well, Robin, the regional weather service for Lazio, which is the region where Rome is, has now said that the record for the highest temperature ever recorded in this area, in this city, has been broken on several occasions in different parts of the city. So temperatures going well above 40.7 degrees, which was the previous record. Because of those record-breaking temperatures, the authorities have been urging residents and tourists to stay indoors between the hours of 11 and 6, when the temperatures were at their highest. We also, at the start of the day, had trade unions demanding or calling for construction sites to be shut because they were saying that, these kinds of temperatures were just far too high for people to be performing that kind of manual labor in. But those calls, as far as we can see, went unheeded. The other group that the authorities were really concerned about was tourists, because with many of them having spent thousands of dollars on flights and hotels, there is that temptation just to kind of shrug off the heat and try and go and tick off those sites on your list, including the Colosseum and the Pantheon. And looking at live cameras over the course of the afternoon, at the hottest periods of the day, there were still lots of people who were, taking that risk and deciding to go out there and try and see the sights, despite temperatures reaching 41 or 42 degrees Celsius.
So new record high temperatures set for parts of Rome then, and further south, temperatures seem to be nearing that European record.
Yeah, this was the day during this heat wave that for several days now, climate scientists have been saying we could see that all-time record for the highest temperature ever seen in Europe broken. The places that they were focusing on were southern Italy, so the islands of Sicily and Sardinia in particular. We've been looking at those areas very carefully as the hours have rolled by. The highest temperatures that we could see were kind of in the mid-40s in places in Sicily. So at this stage, it appears that that record will still stand for now, although of course it seems like with these stronger and stronger heat waves that we're getting here in Italy over the years, that record of 48.8 degrees, that it's only going to be a matter of time before it's broken. The other thing that's concerning authorities here a lot is that having gone through this peak of this current heat wave, it doesn't appear that temperatures are going to drop off anytime soon. Just to give you an example, for Rome, we are going to be having temperatures well into the high 30s, at least until the middle or perhaps the start of next week.
Giles, thank you very much. Our correspondent Giles Gibson in Rome.
China has announced new measures to boost consumer spending to try to spur economic growth. Plans have been released to encourage spending by households on things like home appliances and furniture. Local authorities will introduce targeted policies, including giving out discount vouchers. This comes after China reported economic growth of 6.3% in the second quarter, falling short of predictions.
Renault's low-cost brand Dacia saw its sales rise more than 24% in the first half of this year. Nearly 350,000 vehicles were sold in the 6-month period, with rising numbers reported for all models. Positive news comes despite executives saying production is still being affected by supply chain issues.
Microsoft is trying to extend the deadline for its takeover of video game maker Activision Blizzard. The $69 billion deal won't automatically collapse if the contract expires, but either company would have the right to walk away. An extension would allow more time to find a regulatory solution in the UK, which is currently blocking the deal's completion.
France is to raise household electricity prices by 10% from next month, meaning an additional $13.50 will be added to the average bill. That's lower than the recommendation from regulators, who've been seeking a 70% increase. France has capped energy prices since January 2022, but the country's finance minister is warning that the cap will be phased out by the end of 2024 as the country looks to cut public spending.
The 2026 Commonwealth Games are hanging in the balance after Australia's Victoria state pulled out of hosting it due to its mounting costs. The state premier says the budget is now projected to be almost $4.8 billion US, more than the state can afford. The organisers had previously struggled to find a host before Victoria volunteered in April 2022.
Developing world debt and the cost of climate change are dominating the G20 meeting in India.
Some of the world's top central bankers are also attending the event in Gujarat. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned that the number of developing countries facing unsustainable debt levels has doubled in the last 8 years. There's also been condemnation of Russia by some members over its decision to quit the Black Sea grain deal, which has raised concerns of further food instability in Africa and the Middle East. Well, South Africa has called on the G20 to restructure debt for developing countries and achieve full consensus on climate change. The country's finance minister told CGTN that the group needed to address a string of urgent issues.
And I think the general agreement that we're making progress, we finalized Zambia. We were waiting for the memorandum of understanding to be signed. We will be putting up a credit committee for Ghana. So the next set of issues is the roadmap of the evolution of the multinational development institutions, which is beginning to chart a path for the role of these institutions in the current phase of development. The third set of areas is climate finance. Climate finance then has got its own issues, but there's a lot of discussion on it. It would be useful for me if that discussion focuses on two elements of climate finance, that is mitigation and adaptation.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, keep the chips coming. US semiconductor makers lobby the Biden administration to avert possible curbs on sales to China.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Leading American chip makers have been meeting senior Biden administration officials in an attempt to lobby against potential export controls on goods destined for China. Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. Tell us more about this meeting then.
Well, you know, Jamie and Robin, I think the thing you have to understand is that microchips are in the vanguard of our technological future. They are literally the troops that go over the top in the trenches. And they're in everything these days. Everything you touch pretty much has a microchip in it. I was at a fun fair the other day, and even the little tiny toys that you win from shooting a shooting range has a chip in it. It's extraordinary. So, you know, we can't get away from these things. And so now the chip lobby group, which are the people that speak on behalf of all of America's microchip makers, have turned up at the administration headquarters in Washington, D.C., to make their feelings known to some very key figures, including Antony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, Gina Raimondo, who's the Commerce Secretary, and then beyond that, Lael Brainerd, who's the head of the National Economic Council, and Jake Sullivan, crucially, who is the head of the National Security Council. Now, we don't know for sure because they don't talk about these things, but it is reported that Intel was represented, Qualcomm, which is a very important chip maker here, and I'll tell you why in just a second, and NVIDIA was there as well. And NVIDIA is that company flirting with the $1 trillion status right now after producing that microchip for about $10,000 that helps the gaming industry. Now, their main message was surprising. It was no more China curbs. And I think that that is very, very telling, really, because we know that the Biden administration is thinking about imposing some more curbs on China's microchip industry. And this comes after 2.5 years of almost constant anti-China rhetoric from the administration and others, which has got worse in the 2.5 years, and I think which has surprised a lot of people. I don't think they were expecting it from the Biden administration, but they've got it. At the same time, of course, remember Antony Blinken, who was present yesterday, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, and right now, John Kerry, who is the climate czar, either have been to Beijing or are in Beijing and apparently getting on very well with everybody and making progress and sort of breaking down the barriers that have been allowed to build up in the last 2 or 3 years. No formal comment from the White House, nothing formal from the Commerce Department, but State has been talking and the National Security Council have been talking, and I'm basing my answers on what they've been saying.
John, what do the chip makers say is at stake?
Well, they, of course, want to protect their profits and their business. You know, this is a capitalist country, you know that. Well, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. That's the number one thing. But they say that China, last year, 2022, bought $180 billion worth of microchips on the world market, and that accounts for just over 1/3 of all the purchases made of all the microchips in the world in 2022. They were keen to talk about supply chain issues. Supply chain is, you know, still very vulnerable after COVID. And Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who was in China a couple of weeks ago meeting with President Xi, this is one of the things that came up in his conversation. And he was very keen to hear from these companies on exactly what they think is happening to their supply chain issues. Also, the notion of better disbursements, quicker disbursements under the CHIPS Act, which is the Domestic Production Microchip Act brought in by the Biden administration. And, of course, as I've already said, they want to maintain the market in China. What they don't want is for them to lose any market in China because of administration policies. I gather that was the main thrust. However, we know that in October this year, it is thought that there will be sweeping new rules imposed on China's microchip industry designed to hobble China's microchip industry, and it might even include an executive order from the president. And so, you know, they're saying what they're saying, but we know this is coming up in October. And of course, the final thing to say is that just a couple of weeks ago, China imposed export restrictions on gallium and germanium, which are two crucial forms of chemical element that are used in the production of microchips. And so that's the background to that. And look at what's at stake. Absolutely extraordinary. Qualcomm is the only company to have an export license to sell microchips to Huawei, the Chinese telecom company. NVIDIA has developed an AI chip for the China market, and Intel is trying to catch them up. So there's a lot at stake, and that's why that meeting went ahead.
A lot at stake, steak and chips. John, thank you very much for that. Our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York. Well, responding to those possible further restrictions on U.S. chip firms' links to China, China's foreign ministry has called on Washington to stick to its commitment of not seeking to decouple from Beijing.
China opposes U.S. politicizing and weaponizing of trade and tech issues. It is in no one's interest to place arbitrary curbs on normal technology cooperation and trade, violate the market economy principles, and destabilize global industrial and supply chains. We hope that the United States will follow through on President Biden's commitment of not seeking to decouple from China, halt China's economic development, or contain China and create a sound environment for China-US economic cooperation and trade.
It's a social media showdown fueled by billionaire owners. Threads is on the tail of its older rival, Twitter, breaking download records with already around a quarter of the number of Twitter's active users. The app was only launched 12 days ago by Facebook owner Meta. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
In just 5 days, the social media app Threads was downloaded more than 100 million times, becoming the fastest growing app in the world. Neil Patel Digital analyzed more than 300 users who are on both Threads and Twitter. They found the average hearts per post on Twitter at 4.9, while on Threads it was 31.4. The average comments per post on Twitter was 0.38, while on Threads it was 4.3.
The best way to get people to create content and participate in a network is to give them massive, wide reach. That's what will get you a lot of signups super fast. And then what they'll do is after the platform really grows, after a few years, then they'll start adding monetization, and then they'll have another network that's making them billions of dollars in revenue.
The best thing that happened to Mark Zuckerberg is Elon Musk. This is how I look at it. And Elon Musk is the chief marketing officer for Threads. The way he behaves, he's pushing people to go to Threads. So this is the big opportunity for Mark Zuckerberg. And he understands this one.
Benofa says Threads launched at the right moment when Elon Musk started putting limits on the amount of posts a Twitter user could view. Add to that the numerous opinionated tweets put out by Musk, and plenty of disgruntled Twitter users signed up for Threads.
It's funny that Mark Zuckerberg is lately sort of being seen as a hero and was definitely not seen as that before. And I think it also goes back to the fact that I think, like, you know, I remember eras where like the CEO was invisible and, you know, a company would just be run and you shouldn't hear so much from the leaders.
Musk has threatened legal action, calling Threads a copycat app. The two billionaires have even engaged in banter about fighting each other in a cage match.
I think it reminds me that a lot of the control in this space is in the hands of people that a lot of people don't like, and it creates a sensation that more change needs to happen. I mean, it just feels like a big cosmic joke right now.
Banafa also points out Meta's history of privacy violations, including a $725 million penalty for allowing third parties to access personal information.
You look what kind of information collected when you are downloading Threads, it's just amazing. It's mind-boggling. You're talking about your browsing history, your search history, the device you are using, your purchases, your financials. The worst-case scenario for Meta to have is a data breach for Threads during this critical time.
To join Threads, one must be on Instagram, which makes it easy to transfer followers from one platform to the other. What that also means, if one wants to delete their Threads accounts, they can only do so if they delete their Instagram account, a model some people view as yet another social media trap. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Saving the shipping routes to feed the world. Ukraine's president says the Black Sea grain deal can still work despite Russia's withdrawal.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen acts.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Aerospace and renewables on the agenda. China and Algeria commit to strengthen their ties as the two presidents meet in Beijing.
China and the United States talk cooperation on climate change as both sides agree action must be accelerated.
And US semiconductor makers lobby the Biden administration amid concern about potential restrictions to China.
Ukraine's president says his country should continue exporting grain, despite Russia withdrawing from a key initiative to safeguard supplies.
Volodymyr Zelensky says the Black Sea grain deal remains valid and that his country will find alternative, safe routes for shipping. Our correspondent Louise Greenwood reports.
The last ship to leave Odessa under the Black Sea grain deal being inspected in waters off Istanbul. Russia is suspending participation, saying it hasn't received safeguards for its own agricultural exports. But Ukraine's president says Moscow's withdrawal shouldn't mean the end of the wider arrangement.
Everyone has the right to stability. Africa has a right to stability. Asia has a right to stability. Europe has every right to stability, and therefore we must all care about security, about protection from Russian madness. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative can and should continue to work. If without Russia, then without Russia.
There's been widespread condemnation of Russia's exit from the deal. Humanitarian groups say that since it began a year ago, it's ensured vital food supplies to countries in desperate need. Now, as Moscow quits, the price of wheat and corn has jumped.
The bottom line is it's unconscionable. Should not happen. This should be restored as quickly as possible. And I hope that every country is watching this very closely. They will see that Russia is responsible for denying food to people who are desperately need it around the world.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's main Black Sea ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv were targeted in a wave of overnight attacks. Moscow described it as mass revenge strikes for what President Vladimir Putin called a terror attack on Crimea's Kerch Bridge on Monday.
This crime is senseless. From a military point of view, it has no significance, since the Crimean Bridge has not been used for military transportation for a long time. And inhumane, because innocent civilians were hurt and killed. There will, of course, be a response from Russia.
Turkey, which is a signatory to the Black Sea grain deal, along with the United Nations, also insists that the initiative is salvageable. President Erdogan, currently on a trip to the Gulf, says he'll discuss the matter with Vladimir Putin next month when the Russian president visits Turkey. But with Russia now warning that it can no longer offer security guarantees to vessels using Black Sea shipping routes, rising prices for basic foodstuffs and a more uncertain situation for exports now looks inevitable. Louise Greenwood, CGTN.
The United States has pledged $250 million to support Ukraine's farmers.
The announcement was made by the head of Washington's International Development Agency, who's on a trip to the Ukrainian port city of Odessa. Samantha Power says the money will help boost production and assist in the expansion of alternative export routes after Russia's withdrawal from that grain export deal.
Leaders from the European Union, Latin America and the Caribbean are struggling to agree a joint statement on Ukraine. It comes as they meet for a summit in Brussels. Our correspondent Alex Cadier is there. So, Alex, why are these countries struggling to come to an agreement on Ukraine?
Well, just until a few moments ago, Robin, they were struggling, and we've just got the text now. It's just come through in the last few minutes. They have agreed language on Ukraine, with the exception of one country. So you've got 50-plus heads of state that were at this summit, including President Macron. Franz Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was behind us, and the leaders of Latin American and Caribbean countries. Nicaragua stands alone opposing this language, and this was the language on the invasion of Ukraine that the leaders were debating. We express deep concern on the ongoing war against Ukraine, which continues to cause immense human suffering and is exacerbating existing fragilities in the global economy. Nicaragua's objection was that term against Ukraine, but it is, at least for the EU, seen as a massive diplomatic victory. Just a couple of weeks ago, the CELAC countries, the Caribbean and Latin American countries, did not agree to include particularly strong, if any, language on Ukraine. Now they express deep concern on the ongoing war against Ukraine. The EU has seen that as a very big diplomatic victory, something that they welcome very clearly. There's also further condemnation, or reiterate their support. The leaders reiterated their support for the Black Sea grain deal, which Russia has pulled out of, as we know and as we've reported. and supporting all diplomatic efforts to restore the Black Sea grain deal. And that was really the event that overshadowed a lot of the goings-on here in Brussels. For a lot of these countries, cheap grain is something that will be very important. And President Macron of France just a few moments ago behind me saying, well, look, Russia is actually choosing to weaponize food and starving countries that are already struggling. So that is a very strong statement from the French president, but certainly those leaders agreed on expressing deep concern on the war against Ukraine and agreed on supporting the restoration of that Black Sea grain deal. For the EU, certainly a diplomatic breakthrough.
Alex, thanks very much for updating us. That's our correspondent, Alex Cadier, in Brussels.
Israelis continue to protest against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial overhaul in what's been called a National Day of Resistance. Thousands of people marched to the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, where some threw fake banknotes as symbols of corruption. The police said 17 people were arrested as demonstrators closed down several major roads. This all comes as legislators are preparing to ratify one of Netanyahu's judicial bills, which would limit the power of courts before Parliament goes on summer recess.
An American soldier is thought to be in custody in the DPRK, according to US officials. The soldier is said to have willingly crossed the border during a civilian tour of the demilitarized zone, which separates the two Koreas. There are reports that the soldier was due to face disciplinary action by the US military.
Legislation designed to try and prevent illegal migration into the UK is set to become law after the government won a final series of votes. The bill places a legal duty on the government to detain and remove anyone entering the UK illegally. The United Nations has criticised the legislation, claiming it breaks the UK's obligations under international law. The UK government is hoping to protect domestic energy and hit net zero targets with a new generation of small-scale nuclear reactors.
It's offering grants totalling more than $205 million for companies to accelerate their nuclear business in Britain and develop new reactors. China is already a leader in the industry. Well, our correspondent Li Jianhua is here. So, Jianhua, what's the UK government trying to achieve with this?
The government is rolling out this funding package of over, as you said, $205 million for a couple of reasons. For one thing, to lower the reliance on fossil fuels. For another, to fulfill the promise of providing up to a quarter of electricity production from the UK's nuclear energy by 2050. And also we're looking at that the UK and Europe, they are seeking to rebuild their energy infrastructure in the wake of the energy crisis sparked by the Ukraine war. So this is a quote from the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary Grant Shapps. I'm quoting him. He went on record as saying that by rapidly boosting our homegrown supply of nuclear and other clean, reliable and abundant energy, we will drive down bills for British homes. When it comes to driving down the energy bills, everyone is happy about that, especially that we're still living in a cost of living crisis at this point. But certainly there is some opposition. For one thing, green groups are saying that public funds should be spent on renewable energy or upgrading electricity grid. Is this safe? I mean, nuclear energy is contributing about 10% of the world's energy production, so it is not new. But whenever it comes to the construction of such a facility, be it small or big, we are talking about the safety of it. And the last is no commercial SMRs or small modular reactors are in operation at this point in the world.
Small-scale nuclear is already big business in China, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, now over 70 commercial small modular reactors are being developed in the world, and China has just finished the core module of Linglong 1, which is considered the world's first onshore small modular reactor at this point. It's passed the safety review by the IAEA in 2016. It started in 2021, but because of COVID-19, it was postponed. It's set to be finished by 2026. Upon completion, it is likely to produce about 1 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity every year. That is amount to the energy use of about 520,000 households every year in the world, and that is in line with China's promise to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060.
Jianhua, thank you very much. Our correspondent Li Jianhua. Let's talk now to Dr. Paul Dorfman, who's from the Science Policy Research Unit of Sussex Energy Group. Good to have you with us, Paul. Let's talk about these smaller modular reactors first. How do they differ from the traditional larger-scale ones, and how do they work?
They're simply smaller. They're a cut-size version of a large nuclear reactor. Nuclear has always gone big to find the economies of scale. Big is cheaper. And smaller modular reactors hope to replace the economies of scale with the economies of modularization. In other words, a factory run. But this is as yet unproven.
So you say replacing economies of scale. Is the idea that actually they can be rolled out more widely, more quickly? What's the goal behind them?
Well, I mean, that is the goal. That's the idea behind SMRs. But in practice, there are a lot of questions that remain. It seems that SMRs produce significantly more nuclear waste than conventional reactors. There are questions of, if they are rolled out, where they're going to go to developing nations with potentially less significant regulation, and how long will it take to roll out small modular reactors? Even in China and everywhere, they're still in development. Now, the energy crisis and the climate crisis is here and now. And the question is, can we wait that long?
So the UK government has said more broadly that it wants to revitalise the country's nuclear industry. Will we see more small reactors like these playing a growing part?
I think we need to look at the global situation. I mean, China is world leader in renewables. Utility solar in China is more than all of the world put together. New wind in China capacity is similar to global new capacity worldwide. So if one looks at what's really going on, 84% of all new electricity capacity worldwide put down, last year was renewables. And this year about 90% was renewables, with nuclear nowhere. So it's difficult to understand the emphasis on nuclear. Now, according to Lazard, which is a sort of key financial advisory service everyone believes in, nuclear comes in at about $150 per megawatt hour, a new nuclear, with renewables coming in about $45 per megawatt hour. Now, in the UK, for example, with the cost of living crisis, it seems that putting the burden of the significant cost of new nuclear, including any future SMRs, on the backs of the hard-working people, might prove politically unpopular.
When you look at nuclear power, though, in this country, it's faced some real headwinds, hasn't it? Is it something that should have perhaps been started earlier to be further ahead than where we are now?
You could say that. It's difficult to know. We just have to run with where we are now. We know that in terms of the climate crisis, we need to do something now. We need to do something quick. IPCC, the National Panel on Climate Change, have just stated clearly that renewables are 10 times better than nuclear at CO2 mitigation. So we need to think about where we are, what we can afford, what we can do, and how quickly we can do it. Now, new nuclear, large nuclear, takes up to 20 years. To put down small modular reactors still in development. What we have here and now are renewables, renewables plus storage, interconnection, and the rest.
Is there still a place for nuclear, though? Have we fallen out of love with it altogether?
There are many commentators who begin to question this. I mean, Germany is largely leading the charge on going nuclear free, but of course it has its own problems. There's no such thing as a free lunch. If nuclear were to work, well, all well and good. The problem with it, unfortunately, is that it seems likely to be much too little and much too late for either our climate or our energy crisis.
Paul, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Dr. Paul Dorfman from the Science Policy Research Unit of Sussex Energy Group.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a breakthrough in Alzheimer's research giving new hope to patients and their families.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. It's been called a turning point in the fight against Alzheimer's, a new drug which appears to slow cognitive decline.
Global trials of donanemab show it to be effective in the early stages of this disease, with sufferers developing serious symptoms around 20 to 30% later than normal, allowing them to carry out normal daily activities for longer. This is the second major breakthrough on slowing Alzheimer's in a year after the drug lecanemab made the headlines back in November. Well, John Hardy is Chair of Molecular Biology at Neurological Disease at UCL Queen Square Institute of Neurology in London. He says this research is hugely significant.
It's the beginning of the end. A bit later than that, perhaps, because there was another drug with very similar properties announced by Eisai in November. This was by Lilly today. So we've now got two drugs, both hitting the same target, both causing a slowing of decline, as you said, around 30%. So this is a very important confirmation.
Without scaring us with the PhD science, how does this drug work?
Very simple. It sucks amyloid out of the brain. Amyloid is a protein which builds up in Alzheimer sufferers, like cholesterol in heart disease, and these antibodies basically suck the amyloid out of the brain.
And I know this is a really unfair question, but I'll ask you anyway. I mean, how much closer does the ability to slow the disease down bring us towards treating it entirely?
Oh, we're away from that yet. We've still got stuff to do. As you indicated, it's slowing, not stopping, so we have to understand why it isn't stopping, what other targets we need to hit. Maybe one thing we definitely need to do is get better at diagnosing the disease earlier. It's possible, there is a little bit of data suggesting this, that the drugs would work better if we could diagnose earlier.
To what extent does this breakthrough give something of a morale boost to the research of other progressive brain diseases caused by gradual damage to the brain?
Oh, I think it's always dangerous to say this sort of thing, but this feels, as a researcher, to be a golden era now of research in this area. We've had very exciting data in the last couple of years about motor neuron disease as well, and also hopeful data about Huntington's disease. So we're beginning to understand enough about these neurodegenerative diseases to start to chip away. Plenty still to do, but the air in the research is definitely optimistic.
And what's the significance of the timing? Why now? Was this just a group of you? Was it about timing? Was it about funding? Was it about pandemic? What made it happen now?
So we've had a lot of failed clinical trials. over the last 10 years before these successful ones. And we now understand why the failed clinical trials prevented amyloid building up. But the drugs were given so late in the day that the amyloid was already there. And I think we called them failed clinical trials, but they were learning opportunities for us. And the learning was that we realized that we had to actually clear the amyloid out of the brain. It took several failed trials for if you like, the penny to drop that's what we needed to do. And that's been, I'm going to call it the holdup, but that's how research is. You learn from your mistakes, and that's how it works.
A highly anticipated injection that could help curb the spread of HIV and AIDS in Africa is expected to be rolled out soon.
It's a development being watched closely in South Africa, home to over 7 million people living with the virus. From Cape Town, CGTN's correspondent Julie Shire reports.
Cabotegravir, a breakthrough injection that prevents HIV infection, has been given the green light by the World Health Organization. Cabotegravir is the first drug that could change the course of HIV/AIDS in Africa. South Africa was the only African country involved in the promising 3-phase global study.
Overall, there's a reduction of around, 80-odd% when you consider both the men and the women. But amazingly, amongst the women, we saw the biggest reduction in HIV acquisition that we've seen in any clinical trial for HIV prevention. So a whopping 98% reduction in HIV acquisition. So this is almost unprecedented for us.
South Africa carries the highest disease burden in the world with over 7 million cases. The groundbreaking drug, reformulated from a daily oral pill, could stem the tide of new infections, which took a hit during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Having an injectable that is used weekly is a huge breakthrough in that hopefully these young people could take the injection, be protected, and continue with their lives, but really not acquire HIV at the rate that we have been seeing.
Adolescent girls and young women most at risk of contracting HIV will be first in line for the jab.
Treatment literacy and adequate resourcing are some of the interventions which we need to scale up. We also need to improve on access to treatment and prevention commodities such as PrEP and also pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis, especially for our key populations.
It may be a while before Cabotegravir is widely available. Costs to the public sector are yet to be determined, and global supply is still limited.
It's not as easy to make as a pill. Small molecule pills can be churned out, as we know, even by generic companies. But this is a little more complicated, and so I think it's going to take some time for us to see this really being produced on a sort of mass scale.
Cabotegravir brings hope to ridding the world of HIV for the first time since the disease became a global health issue 40 years ago. The number of HIV cases in South Africa alone more than doubled from 3.68 million to more than 7 million in the last 20 years. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
The headlines again. Aerospace and renewables on the agenda. China and Algeria commit to strengthen ties as the two presidents meet in Beijing.
Our other headlines: China and the United States talk cooperation on climate change as both sides agree action must be accelerated.
And don't ration the chips. US semiconductor makers lobby the Biden administration amid concern about potential restrictions to China.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.